And welcome to the Texas Talks podcast. I'm your host, Brad Swale. Today is another in our special Future of Texas series in partnership with Texas 2036, where we talk with the people shaping the decisions that will define Texas between now and 2036. Today, we're talking about something that underpins everything else in the state, electricity. Texas operates one of the largest and most complex competitive electric systems in North America. It supports a fast-growing state that continues to add people, businesses, and energy-intensive industries. But right now, that system is being pushed in new ways. Demand is rising fast, extreme weather is testing reliability, and new technologies from data centers to battery storage are changing how the grid works in real time. At the same time, Texas has added significant generation and strengthened planning tools over the past several years. So here's the question for today. How is Texas building an electric grid that can keep up with its growth while staying reliable and affordable? Joining me, Pablo Vegas, President and CEO of ERCOT, who leads the organization responsible for operating the grid and wholesale market serving most Texans, and Jeremy Mazur from Texas 2036, who focuses on infrastructure and natural resources opportunities that will shape the state's future. Gentlemen, thank you so much for being here. It's a pleasure.
Thanks for having us. It's a pleasure to be here with you.
Yeah, I think that was a long, sort of a long introduction. I'm excited to really talk about this. I think that ever since Winter Storm Uri, people have been focusing on ERCOT and the grid, probably more than they should in some cases. You know, every time it gets a little bit too cold or a little bit too hot, social media blows up and says, "Can it handle it? Can it handle it?" And so far, it's been great, right?
It has. There's been Winter Storm Uri was a really unique and I'd say an anomalous event in almost any place that has a weather profile like we do here in Texas. That being said, there have been a lot of changes that have happened on the ERCOT grid and into the rules and processes that we follow now that have made a significant difference in improving expected outcomes during inclement weather, whether it's heat or cold. And those improvements are something that we continue to focus on looking ahead. What are we going to continue to do as we expect to see, as you said, growth continuing? We're in the fastest growing state in the United States and have been for years and years. And so we want to continue to support that growth, but do it reliably.
Yeah.
And that's critical in order for us to be successful.
Yeah. I mean, not only were we, the fastest growing or one of the fastest growing, whatever, I'm sure, it varies from year to year, but Texas also has, Texas growing really fast is different than, say, California or Arizona. They all have their own unique problems that they have to face with a growing population, or if they were growing. I don't know if Arizona is growing. It might not be. I don't know. But just to kind of start out, can we break down sort of, walk us through the three parts of the system: generation, transmission, and retail, and how they work together?
Okay. So we have a pretty unique market here in Texas where we are a deregulated electricity market, which means effectively that those who produce electricity, the generators, they are in a competitive market trying to have the lowest cost possible to get electricity sold into the market and being able to sell their product to people who want to buy low-cost electricity. So it's a competitive market that incentivizes low-cost generation. On the retail side, you have the counterparty to that who's buying the electricity on behalf of consumers and making sure that they're going out and selling to consumers a choice option. So if you live in a competitive part of Texas, meaning you have a choice in retail electric providers, you can pick who you want to buy your electricity from based on the price of that electricity, as well as what other services they may offer you for your home or your business. Then the part in the middle is the wires business, the transmission and distribution. That's the one part that remains regulated, because it wouldn't be very efficient to have competitive wires companies building transmission and distribution lines right on top of each other, trying to sell services through those wires to residential customers and to businesses. So that part of the market has remained regulated, and they make investments to try to ensure that there's a way to keep electricity flowing and to support the growth, but they do that under a traditional regulated model, regulated by the Public Utility Commission of Texas.
Yeah. So Jeremy, I want you to chime in here. It's from a policy standpoint. I know that's Texas 2036 and that's your bag. From a policy standpoint, a lot has changed over the past several years with ERCOT, meeting this demand and making sure that some, whatever Uri, anything happens, we're going to be ready. From a policy standpoint, what has Texas gotten right?
So I think what we've done, Winter Storm Uri left an incredibly lasting impression on state policymakers. The fact that electric service was interrupted for so long and caused so much collateral damage across the state, including what was conjectured to be the largest boil water notice in recorded American history,
Sure,
thanks to the power going out. That really made the legislature focus a lot deeper on the importance of electric reliability. And that wasn't really a discussion that we had before February 2021. I think there was some discussion about the role of renewables, the role of oil and gas, but the focus on the issue of electric reliability became priorities 1A, 1B, and 1C after Uri. And the legislature hasn't let go of that. They recognize that in order to have this thing called the Texas economic miracle, you have to have several things in place. And one of those is a reliable, dependable electric grid.
Yeah. Yeah. So, a lot has, I feel like there's a pre-Uri and a post-Uri, and we're in the post-Uri, and a lot has changed since then. And we've got the massive growth from, the COVID surge, and we're still growing. And a lot has been talked about as far as the demand. I remember, I think it was maybe, 2 summers ago, it was Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick sent out a social media post about the demand. The projected demand is, 100% bigger than what we thought it would be by 2030 or something like that. And it was a lot about data centers. And I think we'll talk about that maybe later in the conversation. But a lot has been built or is in the pipeline to be built, I should say. What is the timeline? How does that sort of work? Paint me a picture. So, we have all of these projects that we want to do. How does that process work?
So let me set that up first by maybe explaining the role that ERCOT plays in this whole deregulated model, because we are not the generator, we are not the wires companies, we are not the retailers. The role that ERCOT plays in all of this is we help to orchestrate the flow of power across the grid, matching demand and supply every second of the day. And so that is the role we play fundamentally from an operations perspective. We make sure that there is always enough energy to meet supply or to meet demand, given whatever's going on in the weather, what is going on with the consumption expectations. That's our role, is to match supply and demand. Then the other thing we do is we help to plan the system looking ahead based on what we expect growth to look like. So getting to your question, we play a very critical role making sure that we get inputs from all the different sources that can help inform what's going to happen with growth in the state of Texas. How much businesses are we expecting to grow? How much population growth are we expected to have? What amount of data centers? What amount of other large industrials do we expect to come to the state? We take all that information and synthesize that and put together forecast to show the market, here's what we expect to come. And so that the market, which is effectively those who build power supply and those who sell electricity, know what to expect in the future and can make investments based on that information. Because they don't get a guaranteed return when they make those investments. It's a competitive market. So they have to ensure that they believe that they can be profitable if they make investments in this state.
It's also worth pointing out it takes the market quite a bit of time to deliver these energy solutions. Building a new natural gas generating plant takes 5 to 10 years. Building that generation needed to move either electricity generated from wind and solar or from a natural gas plant also takes 5 to 10 years. You want to have a nuclear plant, you're talking about a 30-year time horizon. So it's going to take the market quite a bit of time in order to deliver the electricity that we need, which makes these forecasts all the much more important.
Why does it take so long? I mean, I guess I can wrap my head around a nuclear plant taking 30 years. That does sound like a long time. Is it? I mean, maybe it's a complicated. They've been built before. It's a rather big building, I guess, but things get built faster than that. Why does it take 30 years for that, or 5 to 10 years for a natural gas? Like, why does it take so long? Is there ways to improve that? I don't know.
I think there's multiple factors. I mean, one of the issues that's often raised is the permitting time needed to secure the permits for these types of plants. One big issue in the energy sector right now is the supply chain. There's the demand for turbine generators that you go with natural gas plants, that's increased 200% over the past 5 years, according to a recent report.
Yeah.
And the delay for getting a turbine for your natural gas plant, it's about a 3 to 5 year window for getting that. So a lot of the reason why, part of the reason is probably permitting, but also a lot of it has to do with, where are the actual materials you need to build this electricity infrastructure in the supply chain.
Yeah.
But I think an important point is to maybe ask as well, why? You're asking, why does it take that? Well, fundamentally, as a country, we have not really been investing in and building gas supply with any regularity over the last 5 to 10 years.
Okay.
What you have been seeing develop across the U.S. and in Texas as well is wind, solar resources, and recently energy storage or batteries. And there's reasons for that. There's been economic incentives put out there to advance renewables and battery storage resources ahead of other type of conventional power plants. Those economic incentives have worked. In our market here in ERCOT, because we're such a market-based service, the financial advantage, as I said, the market was set up for the lowest cost energy to be able to be delivered. When you add financial incentives on top of that, it gives advantages to certain types of resources. And so over the last 10 years, we've seen that play out in what has developed on the Texas grid. We've now become the leader in wind energy in the United States.
Yeah.
We are now the leader in solar energy in the United States. And we are close to and on a year-to-year basis competing to be the battery energy resource leader in the United States. So that is not by accident. That comes as a result of financial incentives that have created a disproportionate benefit to certain types of resources over others. And so as a result, the supply chains to build conventional gas resources have effectively gone out elsewhere to other parts of the world where they've been needed. They haven't been needed in the U.S. Now there's a huge demand all of a sudden because of the demand growth that we are seeing. And so that is restarting these supply chains, and it's going to take quite a while to get caught up to the demand.
Okay. That makes more sense.
Because I think we saw 5 years ago when Congress passed the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act and the Inflation Reduction Act. These included grant programs, loan programs, and even tax breaks for green energy generation, your wind, solar, battery storage, carbon capture, hydrogen, and so forth. That put a substantially heavy thumb on the scale for renewable development, like Pablo just said. What's interesting is under the current administration, a lot of these initiatives from 5 years or longer ago are being phased out. And so it'll be very interesting to see how the market's going to respond once the thumb comes off the scale for these renewables.
Yeah. Jeremy, I want to ask you how water plays into all of this. My understanding, and granted it's a very layman's understanding, that water is, obviously water is talked about a lot in Texas. It's been talked about pretty heavily in the last legislature and the legislature before that. It kind of, to me, I was maybe not paying attention as closely as you, but it sort of came out of nowhere for me. But I'm glad that people are talking about it, investing in water. We need water, I think.
Mm-hmm.
But it's more than just coming out of our tap. I think it also is required for energy production.
Absolutely it is. We always talk about the water supply issue to make sure that your communities and your industry have the water they need for beneficial use.
Yeah.
But a big part of the water equation in Texas is the need for water to make sure you have reliable, consistent generation. It's an interesting story from back in 2011 when Texas endured its worst one-year drought of record.
Yeah.
And this drought hit North Texas particularly bad, especially in Wichita Falls area. There was a generator, a natural gas generator in North Texas that relied on a reservoir that ultimately went dry during the 2011 drought. And that generator, that natural gas plant, went offline for a certain period of time.
Yeah.
And I share that story to point out the relationship between reliable water supplies and the dependability of our electric grid. And as we're watching the current drought unfold in the coastal bend, that's certainly causing headlines in Corpus Christi.
Yeah.
It's going to be a big question if this drought persists and intensifies and the water in the Nueces River Basin goes lower and the reservoirs hit dead pool, what's going to happen to the generators in that basin?
Yeah. Are we doing enough to secure our water resources over the next 10 years?
We're working on it. I mean, the good news, Brad, is that the legislature and voters approved a financial strategy last year
Yeah.
to begin investing in water supply projects that we need for a growing state in terms of population, but also a growing economy. One of the big challenges is like when I said earlier, it takes a lot of time to build your electric infrastructure. You have to double that when it comes to water infrastructure.
Yeah.
And even though we have a water plan and we've identified water projects that we need in this plan, like desalination, water reuse, and even new reservoirs, the issue we're finding is that it's taking way too long to start delivering these projects. And the drought doesn't follow our water plan. The drought's going to show up when God decides it's time for it to show up. And so I think one of the big issues we face in the water sector is being able to identify and deliver these water supply projects that are reliable and timely.
Yeah. So, I mean, it sounds like there's probably, I mean, we've got a good start. We're thinking about it. We got a good financial plan going on, some good investment. Probably going to see some more projects, more focus from the legislature over the next sessions to really make sure that that's managed well.
And I think when it comes to water planning, I think one of the questions we need to look at is what is the relationship between our water resources and the dependability of our electric grid?
Yeah.
We recognize that there's so much generation that needs that reliable, consistent water resource, be it groundwater or surface water. How do we make sure that there's adequate water supplies so this generation doesn't go offline like what we saw 15 years ago in North Texas?
Yeah. So, Mr. Vegas, I mean, we got to talk, about the future. It's the Future of Texas series with Texas 2036, future focused. Texas is growing. We're going to have several million more people by 2036. Are we building power plants fast enough, regardless of the type?
So there's definitely we're at a point where we're seeing the growth of generation supply really taking off. Over the last 2 years, we've added more electric generation to the grid than we have in years prior. So it is growing very quickly. The challenge is the balance of the resources that are coming onto the system. Today, they're pretty unbalanced, as we talked about. They are largely solar and battery resources that are coming online. If you look at the last 2 or 3 years, wind has really slowed down because the economics of solar and batteries are better in the ERCOT market today than they are for wind. And so that seems to be the primary resource that we're seeing. So we are building those resources very quickly, but as you know, they don't provide energy to this in the same way or with the same type of consistency as a conventional gas resource could.
Yeah.
Solar only works when the sun is shining. Batteries are duration limited. In our market, batteries tend to average between 1.5 to 2 hours of duration potential. And so there is a limitation on how long they can run when the solar resources are not available. They are very helpful when it comes to managing episodic needs, like when the sun goes down on a very hot day in the summer. Batteries have really helped to pick up that transition when the sun sets, and ideally the wind starts to blow in West Texas, which is what the pattern in the ERCOT market is. The wind blows stronger at night here.
Yep.
And so it's a great kind of a handoff that occurs, and batteries play a really important part in that. That being said, looking ahead at a future where there is substantial economic growth and energy demand growth, we're going to need to see a balanced mix of resources to serve that, because it's not going to work if it only is available during the day or for a couple of hours after the sun stops shining. That's not going to work. So we need to see a change in that resource mix in order to be able to reliably serve the growth needs for the long term.
Yeah. Jeremy, are you seeing on the policy side more lawmakers thinking about how to speed up this process of building, maybe not more solar? It sounds like we have a lot of that, and that's, good or bad, who cares? Like, personal opinions aside, lawmakers focusing on, all right, we need more, just like Mr. Vegas was talking about, a good mix. You think there's going to be a focus on that from lawmakers?
Yeah, I think that the legislature understands that Texas is certainly a leader in what we call this energy expansion, where this was all the above energy portfolio when it comes to wind, solar, battery, but natural gas, geothermal, and nuclear is going to be the state solution moving forward. With regard to just doing what they can to speed things up, yes, last session and the session before, they passed several bills dealing with nuclear power development geothermal energy development in an effort to make things clearer or to otherwise expedite the development of these energy resources. But I think at the end of the day, Brad, the bigger limiter here is what we have to go back to the supply chain and whether or not the materials can arrive in a timely manner so that you can bring these other forms of generation online. I don't think there's as much of an issue with regard to solar or wind or battery development and deployment, because what we've seen over the past 10 years, that's happened rather quickly and expansively, and much to Texas's benefit. What I like to point out, we've seen record loads during the summers, especially in 2022 and 2023 when we had record hot temperatures. The fact that we had a broad, diversified renewable portfolio certainly helped save our state's bacon when it came to those high demands. But the legislature is also looking at how can we also balance this portfolio to provide more nuclear, geothermal, and where possible, greater natural gas generation.
So I'm glad you brought up geothermal and nuclear. Not that we haven't talked about nuclear; it's more in the context of building it. But geothermal especially, I think that there's a project in South San Antonio that's maybe 15 kilowatts. Is that right? I don't know. Maybe whatever.
Maybe megawatts.
Megawatts. There you go.
Yeah.
That's what I was wondering if I got right. Megawatts. So there's a project down there that if it's successful, they may expand it a little bit. But I think it's an interesting technology as well as nuclear. And this is throwing no shade on wind or solar or whatever, but it's just something that we don't see a lot of. And with, you were saying earlier, looking at the future of Texas, how many data centers are we going to have? It feels like we're getting all of them, right?
That's right. It does feel like that.
So these, maybe I don't know how to phrase it, but unique, maybe not often used technologies, newer technologies, small modular reactors, that sort of thing. I feel like that's sort of an exciting horizon for us to look at.
It is, and let me kind of walk through maybe what the opportunity set looks like for us to avail ourselves of those exciting technologies. The reason that we have this imbalance in the resource mix, we talked a little bit about. We've got these economic incentives that are out there that have favored the renewable resource development as well as the battery storage development. And there's a basis for why. If you go back to when the competitive market started, it was about 25, 26 years ago when deregulation came to the ERCOT market. And at that time, the energy supply that was used across the state was fairly homogeneous in terms of its characteristics. It was a mix of natural gas, coal, and nuclear plants, all of which are considered conventional, dispatchable, thermal generation resources, meaning that they have an on-off switch that you can turn on and off when you need them,
Mm-hmm.
and they have long duration. They can run for as long as they've got fuel, as long as you've got coal, as long as you've got natural gas flowing, as long as you've got nuclear fuel in. So that was the entire market when the market deregulated. And so the rules were set up to try to incentivize the lowest cost version of those types of resources, which is a great idea because then it put competition into the market of those types of generation developers, and it incentivized them to develop the lowest cost version of those resources. Nobody, when they designed the market at that time, envisioned a future where you were going to have massive amounts of wind and solar or battery resources on the grid that had completely different operating characteristics and cost profiles. Because the way that we dispatch energy into the grid here in Texas is we effectively do the lowest cost resource first, and we then dispatch every subsequent generating resource until we get to the last one needed to meet demand at that second, and then that sets the price.
Yeah.
Well, so what's the price of wind and solar? What is their fuel cost? It's zero, right?
Yeah.
No cost for the wind, no cost for the sun. So they all get dispatched first. Gives them an advantage. They're always running because in our market, you only get paid as a generating resource if you are running and delivering electricity. So all these gas plants that exist that are sitting on the sideline waiting to be called on, they're not getting paid. So it changes the whole economic construct that was designed when you insert wind and solar. So now to your question, nuclear and thermal. Well, you then have to ask the question, is this market design right for the mix of resources we have today? Is it valuing the electrons differently? Is the value of an electron that comes from a nuclear plant or a gas plant any different in our market than one that comes from a solar farm or a wind farm? And the answer is no. So the reliability or performance characteristics of those electrons, of where they come from, make no difference in our market. So that is a gap that has to be closed, because if we all agree that it's important to have a reliable electric system that can meet the demand of every consumer under any kind of a growth profile, well, how are you going to incentivize the electrons that come from this type of resource, the conventional, differently than the ones that come from the free ones, the wind and the solar? Well, our construct doesn't do that. So if you want to see more thermal, if you want to see more geothermal, if you want to see more nuclear, you're going to have to find a way to value what that brings, because geothermal is long duration. It can have an on and an off switch. Same with nuclear, but we're not valuing those electrons any differently. The fact that they bring that reliability, they bring that duration, there's no additional incentive for that. So in our market, which takes only the cheapest energy first, it sits far back on the stack, costing more than conventional gas. So it'd be very difficult to develop that in our market without somehow valuing their electrons for the characteristics that they bring differently than the others. That's the key. That's the missing link that we have to change in our market.
I mean, that's a really interesting answer, and I want to, like, should we? I mean, I get it. An electron to my house or my business or whatever, I don't really care so long as the light turns on, right? And my, if I'm on dialysis, my dialysis machine works, right? All that sort of stuff. That's what really matters. Where it comes from, maybe not. But how the electron was produced, maybe could matter. Like you said, it more reliable or more abundant or whatever.
Different characteristics. I think that's the way to put it. They all have differing performance characteristics and benefits associated with them. They have different reliability benefits. They have different environmental implications. Yeah. They have different availability characteristics. All those are different characteristics that are not valued in any way differently among them. Yeah. And that is a challenge if you're trying to build a balanced portfolio, an all of the above portfolio, which I agree completely with Jeremy's point. We are open to an all of the above portfolio, but we need a construct that actually incentivizes that and that creates that. So that's the issue that we have to work through.
That's interesting. I mean, there's a lot. I know a lot of people that value solar just because of what it is, right? They'll pay extra for, a solar panel on their house that, maybe in the long run, it takes a long time for it to really sort of balance out on the balance sheet, but they feel like they're doing something good for the planet, and, maybe they are, whatever, but they value that more. And there's that moral value that they're adding to it. And I wonder if that might change how we look at other, nuclear or geothermal. Like, they have similar properties as far as, I know a lot of environmentalists may not like that I just said that, but whatever. They have environmental properties that are positive generally, better than coal for sure.
Well, yeah, a nuclear plant doesn't emit any carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Geothermal as well. So yeah, absolutely. It has very similar benefits from that point of view. And it also has interesting reliability benefits. But if we don't value those differently, then they're going to really struggle in a market that's driven only by the lowest cost resource. Yeah.
So, Jeremy, I brought up AI, and I didn't say AI, I just said data centers, but it's sort of the same thing, right? It's all the same at this point. That is something that's been talked about quite a bit, and there's controversies depending on where the data center is going to be built, and some people hate it, some people love it, some people don't care, whatever. I try not to lose sleep at night over that sort of stuff, sort of out of my control a little bit. But, how do you see that conversation panning out over the next, say, 5 years over data centers? I mean, they're coming.
Well, it's been fascinating, Brad, because 5 years ago, when data centers entered the policy discussion in Texas, it was with a lot of fervor and excitement about what the opportunities were with data center development in terms of jobs, local revenue development, Texas being on the cutting edge of the digital frontier. 5 years ago, data centers were something new, fresh, and exciting. Yeah. And here we are in 2026, where there are big questions being asked with regard to the loads associated with these data centers, the water intensity, and also what the local economic value or benefit is from the development of these data centers. we know that Virginia is the nation's leader when it comes to data center development, and Texas is falling close behind. And this legislature, especially over the interim, I think they're getting a lot of pressure from constituents. They're seeing a lot of proposed data centers, and they're asking a lot of questions, like if at the end of the day, this is something Texas also needs to be a leader in, especially when we look at the electric demands associated with data centers. When we look at the ERCOT forecast, which anticipates a near doubling of load over the next 10 years, a substantial portion of that demand, I think about 75%, is attributable to projected data center development. But the big question we have, Brad, is like we hear a lot of talk about these data centers that are being proposed in one community or the other, but we don't yet know what's actually going to be built at the end of the day. And so we're aware that if every data center proposed right now is built, we're going to need a lot of electricity and potentially some water to serve them. But at the end of the day, we don't know what that business decision is ultimately going to be.
So follow up for you, Mr. Vegas. So building off of what he just said, ERCOT projections a 200% increase. Is that what you said? 100% increase? 75% of which?
Approximately, about 100% increase.
It's 100% increase.
Close to that.
75% of which comes from data centers. A lot of talk has been, I think even from the federal level, of who pays for that. And I think a lot of consumers, just household consumers, maybe that's not something that they really think about, that they would have to pay for that would somehow, in fact, affect their bill. But I'm wondering if you could maybe elucidate a little bit.
Yeah, it's becoming a very important part of the conversation, and it should be. So in our market, the question about who pays is important to kind of dissect across the pieces and parts. So to build new generation in order to serve growing load, those that invest in building those power plants, they have to take on the capital risk of building those facilities.
Yeah.
And they do that with the assumption that then there'll be a demand for it and somebody will buy that electricity down the road. So it is a fairly, I'd say, efficient competitive market construct that exists. And typically you don't see an overbuild of supply, because if you do that, companies quickly will go out of business. If they're not dispatched in our market, then they don't make any money and then they go bankrupt. And so you tend to see, in fact, the opposite occur in our market, where there is a lag in the development of generating resources behind demand growth, because those that are making billions of dollars of investments want to ensure that there's certainly going to be customers that need it in order to justify building those plants. And, an old saying, which is, the cure for high prices is high prices, that actually is true in a market like this, where when prices go up because the demand exceeds supply, and then you build new supply into that, then the prices go back down and it moderates it. So that's the way our competitive generation market works. And it should continue to work that way in terms of its kind of core economics. The area where I think there's more attention focused, where there's more maybe control or direct understanding of the costs, is around the development of the transmission infrastructure to serve and connect all of these new resources, the new supply and the new demand. That is something that gets approved by the Public Utility Commission. It gets proposed by the transmission companies, approved by the commission, and then it gets put into rates that everybody has to pay on their electric bill. Now, historically, if you look over the last 10 years, Texas has done a very efficient job of investing in transmission infrastructure. We have been steadily increasing the amount of transmission we're building over the last 10 years. I think in 2015, we put into rates about $3 billion of new transmission infrastructure. That has gone up every year. And in 2024, we put $5 billion that year into rates based on the transmission that was built. However, over that exact same time period, that 10-year period, the average cost of transmission per the amount of energy used in the state of Texas has stayed flat. And it's actually declined a little bit over that time. And the reason being is that we're growing so fast, because the way transmission costs get allocated, they get essentially spread to the users of electricity. And if more and more users are coming, meaning the denominator is growing, then the investment, which is up in the numerator, gets spread over a larger base.
Yeah.
And that's effectively what's happened in Texas over the last 10 years. When you look forward over the next 10, you're expecting the growth to be driven by more demand, large users of energy. So what we have to get right as a state is the way that the tariffs are put in place that allocates the cost of the transmission built to serve all that growth, to make sure that the consumers that are driving it, which are the big data centers, that they're paying for it. And so that's a rate design issue, and that's an opportunity. And the Public Utility Commission of Texas is taking that up in rule this year, how that allocation is going to work to make sure that it's fairly allocated to the people that are driving the investment in the infrastructure in Texas.
Okay. So, Mr. Vegas, I guess given all right, maybe Virginia is going to have more data centers. That's surprising. I almost don't believe that that's true, but whatever. They can have it for now. I'm sure we'll catch up. Given that there's this huge boom of data centers, and at the end of the day, what does a data center even do besides? Is it just the cloud? Is it AI? I don't know. Why do you need so many? How does ERCOT account for that? I mean, it seems like there's maybe some people feel uncertain about that. How can we power this? They demand so much, and people have this. Some people have this feel that already energy's sort of on the we're right there on the cusp and stuff like that. So how does ERCOT ensure that the planning reflects what that everything's going to be successful for that?
Yeah, I think we start first with making sure that the planning reflects the reality of what's actually going to be developed. That's a really important piece to spend at least a minute on. It's because right now the projected forecast, when you look at the varying forecast across many different sources, it likely is it's likely high compared to what's actually going to be developed over the next 5 to 10 years. What we got in our load for projections last year was a growth of well over 100 gigawatts of data centers just in ERCOT. And that if you look at our queue that we are managing of the interest of developing, it's over 400 gigawatts. That's 400,000 megawatts. To put that in context of our grid today, that is more than 4 times the current size of the ERCOT grid at its peak, at its hottest day in the summer. So it is clearly far above the numbers of the forecasts that are out there are far above what the reality is that's going to be built. So we need to get down to what's actually going to be built, what's realistic, and then to answer the question, are we going to be able to do that? I think the answer is yes, because I think part of the solution is going to be the data centers themselves. They are going to bring with them relationships and contracts that will ensure that power is going to get developed to serve them. Because when you look at the total cost of building one of these tremendous AI data centers, the energy cost associated with it is a fairly small component relative to the compute and the chips and everything else that goes to support that. Not that it's insignificant, but it is small compared to the total. So they are willing to make investments to ensure that power will be there as long as all the rest of the pieces of the puzzle are ready to move forward. They're really interested in speed to the market so that they can get a competitive advantage against their competitors and be able to develop and connect those data centers as quickly as possible. There's another thing that we have that is, I think, part of the Texas secret sauce, which is going to help to ensure we do this all reliably. And that is what has passed in the last legislative session, Senate Bill 6. Senate Bill 6 provided the rules of the road for how data centers need to behave and perform in the ERCOT grid. And one of the very important provisions in there required data centers that if the grid gets into a scarcity condition, if we are, low on power because it's an incredibly, hot summer day or an extreme cold winter storm, that data centers have to turn off first before anybody else does.
Yeah.
What that means is then that there will not be load shed for an everyday mom and pop residential customer or business before a data center turns off. And so that really changes the reliability equation of data centers. So even if we come to a point in the future where, demand is exceeding supply, and we've seen that, because of whatever's happening with the weather, we have a situation to deal with, data centers have to be part of the solution.
That's interesting. And I mean, I understand the motivation behind it. You want to protect everyday Texans. A data center certainly doesn't seem nearly as important as a hospital, right? In an
Exactly.
emergency, or, my grandmother's air conditioner, or whatever the case may be, right? But it does seem like data centers are so intertwined with our future economy that if you turn one off, that might shut off part of the economy. I don't know. It just kind of feels that way. But I'm wondering if there's a lot of talk about data centers, and maybe this happens at the Capitol quite a bit. Jeremy, maybe you can chime in on this one for sure. But having these data centers have their own sort of mini power plants. Whether that's a solar farm or a small nuclear reactor or geothermal or whatever it is, to where they don't. I know, and trust me, I know a lot of people that would love their own, to be off grid and just have their own solar panels and not have to worry about all that stuff. I wonder if that's part of the future, is at letting people have that sort of independence, or businesses or large consumers like a data center have that sort of independence from the grid.
When you look at the market participants that are building these data centers,
Yeah.
they're trying to, of course, expand their footprint in Texas. A lot of reasons for that, one of which being the tax code, the other being the availability of land. But I think they're also sensitive to being good neighbors. And so they're highly aware of the impacts that their proposed development could have on energy demand and water resources. And so a lot of them are actually exploring these behind the meter solutions for their own generation, where they either have their own on-site natural gas generator,
Sure.
or geothermal well, or even solar. And I think that's part of the excitement that we see with regard to data center development, is because these are not only big companies, but also well financially endowed companies that are showing up that can make these capital investments to build the infrastructure for continued operation.
Yeah. So I want to talk about looking at the future, the future of Texas series, Texas 2036, the next 10 years. What do electric bills look like for the regular everyday consumer? I know that a lot of people are worried about the price of everything sort of just going up with the past several years. It seems like maybe it's slowed down a little bit, but it still exists. The prices are still coming up a little bit. I can't escape HEB without, I don't know, hundreds of dollars on stuff that maybe I could do like 150 a few years ago. Now it's 250. Maybe I should stop buying some of maybe I should buy the store brand sometimes. I don't know. But, people I think are rightly concerned about electric bills as well. And I'm wondering if y'all have thoughts about that. What's going to be done?
Well, I think that when you look at the electric bills, look at the short term and the medium to long term. In the short term, when we're seeing volatility in natural gas prices right now,
Yeah.
that could certainly spike some electric bills,
Sure.
especially with the Iranian conflict ongoing and WTI and Henry Hub gas prices going up.
Yeah.
That could have a short term impact on residential and business prices. With regard to medium term and long term prices, as Mr. Vegas said, when we have transmission being built, that's going to be another cost that's going to be going into our bills. We need to pay for that transmission somehow. And so I think that's going to be an accelerator or a cost driver with regard to future bills. The one factor that's been beneficial and why future bills could be higher than they are is that we've had all this renewable development and deployment. And so that is to a certain degree going to be providing something of a benefit to consumers in the future, insofar as future energy prices could have been higher if we didn't have this renewable. But we're even with that benefit of a broad, diverse renewable generating fleet, we're probably going to still see prices go up.
Yeah.
I would maybe add to Jeremy's answer in that it's important to understand what drives electricity prices to kind of get a sense for what to expect in Texas or wherever you live. And so one of the most important influences of electricity prices that people pay is what fuel is available to provide electricity where they live. So if you live in a part of the country where there's an abundance of renewable resources, you'll get the benefit of the cost of those lower cost resources. Hydropower is a great example. In the northwest part of the country, there's abundance of hydropower resources. And you see in areas that are served by that hydropower, very low electricity rates. Today, Texas sits on average in the bottom 10. If you look at the cost, we're the 10th cheapest state for electricity prices per a recent report that came out just a week ago. That's a good starting point to start from, and it's because we have abundant, renewable resources. we are close to natural gas supply, and natural gas costs are fairly low here in the state of Texas and have been for a while. So the fuel cost is a big part of that. Then the other side of it is everything associated with policy. So what is your policy in terms of how you support rates? And do you allocate the costs of infrastructure like transmission in a way that's fair and driven by who causes it? Are there other things that you pass through or have requirements on your electric bills that you make people pay for, like energy efficiency programs or other type of things? So there's a big policy implication on the cost of what people pay for. And so the combination of those two have led to very good low-cost electricity rates here in the state of Texas for quite a while. I do think that there will be cost pressures across the country as the growth needs to keep up with the reliability.
Yeah.
And that's something that, building more renewables only is not going to satisfy. You need to also have this full portfolio available. That has a different cost profile. The whole country is going to see that. But I think our positioning in Texas is very good for that growth that's coming our way.
Okay. So one more question for each of you. Jeremy, I want to ask you, you're big on policy guy. I don't know, is wonk, is that a bad term? That's
I go policy guy is cool.
Policy guy's cool.
Yeah,
all right, policy guy. So I don't know if it's derogatory or not, wonk, but so policy guy. And so, circling back to Winter Storm Uri, I think a lot of regulations, a lot of focus has been changed a lot of focus has been made at the legislature and in the state about improvements that could be made. Sort of go over those and then look crystal ball into the future to 2036. What things do you think will be made or need to be made?
So, Brad, I was at the Railroad Commission of Texas in February 2021 when Winter Storm Uri happened. And I remember being on those calls when the disaster was unfolding. And it was basically like a disaster movie in slow motion.
Sure.
There were oil and gas operators that had no electricity. There were pipeline companies worried about the gas pack in their pipelines. There was a whole series of issues and problems that arose during Winter Storm Uri that in the after action assessments and response that the legislature undertook after that disaster, I think have been very successful in solving a lot of those problems, where we now make sure that when there's an energy emergency, that we don't cut off power to the oil and gas fields, so they can still generate the hydrocarbons we need to generate electricity. And I point to that and there have been several other changes that we've made to make our grid more resilient to extreme weather risks. With regard to looking forward, the work that we've done at Texas 2036 with regard to extreme weather risks, especially what we've found from the off-state climatologists at Texas A&M University, is that those extreme weather risks are not going to go away. In fact, I think living with extreme weather is part of the Texas experience. We're going to have hotter temperatures. We're going to have extreme thunderstorms like Hurricane Beryl, which was a hurricane.
Sure.
Drought is going to be part of the Texas experience. All of these things are going to put added stresses onto our electric grid. The good news is that I think we're seeing how extreme weather is actually informing and instructing the legislature with regard to what to do to make our grid more resilient.
Yeah.
Is it 100% resilient to the next Winter Storm Uri or a winter storm of that magnitude? I couldn't predict, but I could say that we have a better spitting chance next time around than we did in 2021.
That's good to hear. And Mr. Vegas, sort of maybe a wild card question, I don't know, but what's the most, creative opportunity or unconventional risk, something that maybe people aren't focusing on quite as much, positive or negative, that you think that they should be when it comes to the grid?
Can I add one more thing?
Oh, yeah, of course,
Jeremy's
please.
list, and then I'll answer your question. One of the things that the legislature did right after Winter Storm Uri that has been very impactful was make a requirement to inspect and to weatherize both generating and transmission facilities to be able to perform in extreme weather.
Okay.
So the power plant operators as well as the transmission substation operators, they have to weatherize their facilities to be able to meet extreme heat and extreme cold conditions. And they put an inspection regime in place that ERCOT performs. And we go out every season, every summer, every winter, and we inspect large portions of the generators and the transmission facilities that are out there. And that has made a very significant impact on the performance of these resources during those types of winter events. So that's just one other example that
Sure.
is a high impact example of a change that was made and that we were able to do quickly because our state legislature saw the need, passed the law, and the rules were put in place quickly. So one of the things as I look ahead to your last question that I think is creative and interesting and exciting is thinking about how to leverage the type of energy resources that are distributed out on the edge of the grid is kind of the term we use, which is in the homes, in the businesses of consumers throughout the state. And if you think about that concept, it's kind of like a decentralized capital construct, something like along the lines of what Uber did. They used the cars that all of people owned and created a business around the Uber business. Airbnb did that with the homes that people own and created a business. Well, what about the assets that people own in their homes? If they've got rooftop solar, if they've got an electric vehicle, if they've purchased a smart thermostat, if they have a battery for resiliency, we could tap into and use those resources with the permission and participation of those people and give them an economic benefit, pay them for it, just like in those other examples. That's something that's actually possible. We are doing that in a pilot scale today with providers around different parts of the state and with consumers, and we are seeing that it actually works. So we have this potential to not only think about resources through the big power plants and the big wind and solar farms, but also in the resources that are across millions and millions of homes that could be tapped into and could help with both the reliability, the resiliency, and the economics of the market of the future. And so the technology is there today to do it. We need to put in place some of the rules around that, and I think that's a really exciting potential down the road.
That sounds exciting. Well, gentlemen, thank you so much. I really appreciate you being here.
Thanks for having us.
Thank you,
Brad.
Yeah. So Texas remains one of the country's fastest growing large states. Keeping up with that growth isn't just about adding more power. It's about building a system that can operate at scale, under pressure, and over time. That's exactly the kind of long-term challenge Texas 2036 is focused on as we approach the state's bicentennial. I want to thank our guests today and encourage you to learn more at texas2036.org. Thank you for listening, and we'll see you next time.